The factory has been silent for over 2 years, not temporarily, not for routine maintenance, completely, unnervingly silent. 3,000 workers, machinists, line operators, engineers, people who built Dodge Challengers and Chrysler 300s with their hands for decades, have been sitting at home waiting for a phone call that keeps not coming. And while they wait, one of the largest automakers on earth is in the middle of a maneuver so audacious, so strategically calculated, that when Canada's industry minister finally said the quiet part out loud, it cut through every layer of corporate language like a blade. "We can't bring cars in a kit to Canada." That is the sentence. That is the line that cracked the story open, because behind those 9 words sits a $500 million contract, a geopolitical standoff involving 3 of the world's most powerful economies. A Chinese electric vehicle company you've probably never heard of that sold nearly 600,000 cars last year, and a decision that could either protect Canada's industrial future or permanently hollow it out. And the mainstream media has mostly covered it as a trade dispute, a spat, a footnote in the bigger tariff war between the United States and everyone else. It is not a footnote. It is the blueprint for what happens when a government puts its faith in a multinational, signs the checks, and then watches that multinational rewrite the terms from the inside. Understand what is actually at stake here. The number being thrown around is $529 million. Canadian taxpayer dollars committed through the Federal Strategic Innovation Fund. Money signed over in a 2022 agreement designed to transform a Brampton, Ontario assembly plant into a flagship electric vehicle manufacturing hub, securing jobs through at least 2035 and anchoring an entire regional supply chain. That money came with binding conditions, employment floors, production timelines, contractual obligations that read, in plain English, as a promise. And Stellantis, the company behind Jeep, Chrysler, Dodge, Fiat, Ram, and Maserati, has now been formally served with a notice of default by the Canadian federal government. Default. Not a warning, not a conversation, a default notice, as in, you violated the contract, as in, we are coming for our money. This is not a story about a factory. This is a story about sovereignty, about whether a government can actually enforce the terms it sets when a $1 trillion corporation decides those terms are inconvenient. And the answer to that question has consequences that extend far beyond Brampton, Ontario. It will shape how every major automaker, every battery manufacturer, every foreign investor thinks about doing business in Canada for the next generation. We know exactly how this deal came apart because the timeline is documented, the filings are public, and the chain of events is traceable step by step. In 2022, Stellantis announced a $3.6 billion Canadian investment in its Ontario operations, Brampton and Windsor, backed by federal and provincial subsidies. The Brampton plant was to be fully retooled, modernized, converted for electric vehicle production, and would anchor the next generation of the Jeep Compass. The deal required Stellantis to maintain an average of 4,475 full-time workers across its Canadian operations and keep Brampton running through December 2035. Ontario's provincial government had pledged an additional $132 million. The federal commitment was up to $529 million through the Strategic Innovation Fund. Of that $529 million, federal accounting records show the government had already disbursed more than $220 million before Stellantis made the move that broke everything. Then Donald Trump happened. In early 2025, the Trump administration imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian-made automobiles. Not a threat, not a negotiating position, an actual implemented tariff. And the economic math for Stellantis changed overnight. Producing a vehicle in Canada and shipping it into the United States suddenly cost 25 cents more on every dollar of value. So in February 2025, Stellantis paused the retooling work at Brampton. And then in October 2025, the company confirmed what everyone already knew was coming. The next generation Jeep Compass would be produced not in Brampton, Ontario, but at the Belvidere, Illinois plant, part of a sweeping $13 billion U.S. investment plan Stellantis announced to satisfy Washington's appetite for domestic job creation. 3,000 Canadian workers, gone. The plant, dark. Here is what that sequence tells you. Stellantis did not make a manufacturing decision. It made a political arbitrage decision. It looked at two governments, identified which one was making threats with immediate financial consequences, and optimized accordingly. The 25% tariff was a gun pointed at their margin. The Canadian contract was a gun pointed at their reputation. They chose reputation over margin every time a corporation of this size operates in the short term. And they assumed, as multinationals almost always assume, that the government with the smaller economy would eventually accept something, anything, rather than nothing. That assumption is now being tested in real time. Picture the moment the Leapmotor proposal landed in Ottawa. Not a press conference, not a formal filing. It leaked first through Unifor, the union representing those 3,000 laid-off workers, whose national president, Lana Payne, described it before Stellantis even confirmed the plan publicly. That detail matters. The union found out, and the union told the country before the corporation acknowledged a word of it. That is not how a company presents a good faith proposal. That is how a company floats a trial balloon through a back channel to test the temperature before committing. The temperature was not warm. Here is what Stellantis was proposing. A partnership with Leapmotor, a Chinese electric vehicle manufacturer, in which Stellantis holds a 20% ownership stake and 51% of a joint venture called Leapmotor International, which controls all of Leapmotor's business outside China. Under the proposal, vehicles would be manufactured almost entirely in China, shipped to Brampton in what the industry calls knockdown kits, semi-knockdown or completely knockdown, depending on the configuration, and then assembled at the Brampton facility by local workers performing tasks like attaching doors, installing wheels, and completing finishing work. On paper, it looks like production. In practice, it is something else entirely. By the time those kits arrive in Brampton, the body has been stamped, the paint has been applied, the powertrain has been installed, the interior has been fitted. The vast majority of the labor hours, the engineering hours, the supplier relationships, the parts sourcing, the economic value, all of it has already happened in China. What remains in Canada is a glorified installation job, not manufacturing, not the kind of activity that feeds a regional supplier ecosystem, develops domestic engineering capacity, or justifies a $500 million public subsidy. Vito Beato, president of Unifor Local 1285 in Brampton, said the proposal would add a fraction of operations at the plant. He said it would decimate the Canadian auto industry. Those are not hyperbolic words from a union rep protecting turf. Those are accurate descriptions of what SKD Assembly actually does to a domestic industrial base. And here is where the receipts start to pile up in ways that cannot be explained away. Receipt number 1. The funding agreement Stellantis signed in 2022 was not ambiguous. The contract, portions of which have since been made public through access to information requests and parliamentary testimony, required Stellantis to maintain production at the Brampton plant through December 2035, with a specific carve-out for situations where levies or significant market disruptions materially affect the company's ability to comply. Stellantis has argued implicitly that Trump's tariffs constitute exactly that kind of disruption. Canada has responded by filing a notice of default on December 4, 2025. Industry Minister Joly stood before a parliamentary committee and said, without equivocation, "Today, on December 4th, I'm formally announcing that we're serving Stellantis with a notice of default under the contracts." That is not a negotiating tactic. A default notice is a legal instrument. It is the trigger that begins the formal process of recovery. The question of whether the tariff clause provides Stellantis with a genuine legal defense is now a live legal question, and the answer will determine whether Canada gets its money back or spends the next decade in arbitration. Receipt number 2. Of the $529 million committed, the government had paid out more than $220 million before the Jeep Compass move was announced. Federal public accounts show $306 million remains in the pipeline, with $94 million scheduled for this fiscal year alone, followed by $95 million in 2027 and $79 million the year after. The government has said clearly it will not release another cent under current conditions, but the $220 million already paid is the exposure. That is the public money sitting in Stellantis' accounts right now, attached to a contract the company is in breach of. And the amendment to the original contract, the details of which are largely redacted under commercial sensitivity protections, includes a clause requiring Stellantis to repay the government in the event of default. Canada is not bluffing about wanting that money back. The legal framework exists. The political will, at least publicly, exists. What does not yet exist is a court judgment or a settlement. That gap is where the real fight is happening. Receipt number 3. The government has not waited passively for a resolution. It has already cut Stellantis' tariff-free import remission quota by 50%. That is a direct financial penalty applied through regulatory authority rather than litigation, a way of creating immediate cost pressure on Stellantis without waiting for the dispute resolution process to conclude. The remission quota allows automakers to import a certain number of vehicles into Canada duty-free, and cutting it in half means Stellantis now pays more to bring its vehicles into the Canadian market. That is money Stellantis feels immediately, in every quarterly earnings report, in every supply chain calculation. It is Canada using the tools it actually has right now, while the larger legal fight plays out on a slower timeline. Receipt number 4. Leapmotor sold nearly 600,000 vehicles in 2025 and is publicly targeting 1 million deliveries in 2026. This is not a struggling startup looking for a lifeline. This is an aggressive, fast-scaling Chinese manufacturer using Stellantis' international infrastructure, including its European factories, its Latin American footprint, and now potentially its Canadian plant, to expand rapidly into global markets. The knockdown kit model is core to this expansion strategy. Leapmotor and Stellantis are already planning to use it in Brazil and Malaysia. It is efficient. It is cost-effective. It allows Chinese automakers to enter new markets at speed without building local manufacturing capacity. And it has been used successfully in multiple countries, right up until the moment local governments started calculating how little value it actually creates domestically and began pushing back, exactly as Brazil has done, exactly as Canada is doing now. But that is only part of it. Here is what every other outlet is missing about this story. The Leapmotor proposal does not exist in a vacuum. It sits at the intersection of the most delicate diplomatic triangle Canada has navigated in decades: its relationship with the United States, its relationship with China, and its need to maintain industrial sovereignty while both relationships are under stress simultaneously. Here is how to decode that triangle. In January 2026, Prime Minister Mark Carney's government struck a deal with China to reduce EV import tariffs from 100% down to 6.1% on a quota of 49,000 Chinese-made electric vehicles. The trade: lower Chinese duties on Canadian canola and other agricultural exports. Ottawa framed this as a step toward attracting Chinese joint venture investment into the Canadian EV supply chain. Real investment, meaning factories, parts sourcing, engineering, the full ecosystem. That deal immediately triggered alarm in Washington, where officials interpreted it as Canada warming to China during a period when the U.S. is aggressively trying to exclude Chinese EV technology from North American markets. The reaction revealed something important. The United States is watching Canada's China alignment with extreme sensitivity, and any shift toward Beijing, even a calibrated one, creates political friction with Washington that Canada cannot afford to ignore. Now layer in the Stellantis situation. Stellantis is proposing to bring Chinese vehicles into Canada through a knockdown assembly model, which is functionally similar to what the January quota deal was supposed to discourage in favor of real Chinese investment. Canada's response: rejecting the knockdown proposal while maintaining the 49,000 vehicle quota, sends two signals simultaneously. To China: we want your investment, not just your imports. To Stellantis: if you are going to use Chinese vehicles to fulfill your obligations to Canadian taxpayers, those vehicles need to create Canadian jobs, not just use Canadian workers as a finishing service for Chinese manufacturing. Let me translate that into plain language. Ottawa is trying to thread a needle that has almost never been successfully threaded in modern industrial policy, attracting a new industrial powers capital without becoming dependent on its supply chains. Every economist who has watched the Brazilian knockdown experiment, the Southeast Asian assembly model, the Eastern European finish and ship operations will tell you the same thing. Once a country accepts the knockdown precedent, the leverage shifts permanently. You become a logistics node, not a manufacturer. Your workers become assemblers, not engineers. Your suppliers dry up. Your domestic industrial capacity atrophies. And the next time you need to renegotiate, you have nothing to bargain with. Does Canada understand that it is making a generational bet right now? The psychological dimension of this confrontation is where the story gets genuinely complicated, because the players are operating from fundamentally different playbooks, and understanding those playbooks is the only way to predict where this ends. Stellantis is a corporation built on the logic of global arbitrage. It was formed in 2021 through the merger of Fiat Chrysler and PSA Group, creating an entity that spans 14 brands across nearly every major automotive market on Earth. Its entire operating philosophy is built around the ability to shift production, shift sourcing, and shift strategic emphasis in response to regulatory and tariff environments. That is not a criticism. That is a description of how large multinationals survive. When Trump's tariffs made Canada expensive, Stellantis moved production to Illinois. When Canada threatened to claw back subsidies, Stellantis proposed the Leapmotor model. When that was rejected, the company went silent, working constructively with government partners, in the language of its spokesperson. Each move is a probe. Each retreat is a repositioning. The corporation is not panicking. It is iterating. Mélanie Joly is operating from a different playbook entirely. She is a politician in a government that campaigned on economic sovereignty in the face of American trade aggression. And she is playing to a domestic audience that is simultaneously angry at the United States for the tariffs, suspicious of China's industrial intentions, and desperate for concrete action on job losses that have been accumulating for years. Her language has been deliberately, precisely hard. We will get our money back. We can't bring cars in a kit to Canada. These actions are not symbolic. They are the direct consequence of a violation of clear commitments. Every public statement is designed not just to pressure Stellantis, but to signal to the Canadian public that the government is not going to be rolled. That matters in the context of an upcoming election cycle and in the context of a country watching its largest trading partner treat it with increasing contempt. Notice what neither side has done. Stellantis has not walked away. It has not announced it is closing the Brampton plant permanently. It has not dared the government to take it to arbitration. That silence is significant. It means Stellantis believes there is still a deal to be made, one that is better than the current standoff, and it is waiting to see how far Canada will push before proposing something new. And Ottawa has not yet filed for damages in a court. It has issued a default notice, launched a dispute resolution process, cut the remission quota, but it has not gone to litigation. That also is significant. Litigation is expensive, slow, and uncertain. A settlement, even a partial one, is always preferable if the political optics of accepting it can be managed. This standoff is in the gap between those two positions, and that gap is closing. Professor Brendan Sweeney of the Trillium Network for Advanced Manufacturing, who has spent years studying Ontario's automotive ecosystem, has put it plainly. The Brampton situation is not just about one plant. It is about whether Southern Ontario retains the capacity to anchor a domestic EV supply chain at all. If the facility converts to knockdown assembly, the Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers, the parts makers, the stamping companies, the electrical component manufacturers, lose their customer. They don't wait. They restructure or close. And once that supplier ecosystem fractures, rebuilding it takes not months, but decades. Unifor's national president, Lana Payne, has been equally direct, saying that what Stellantis is proposing is not manufacturing. It is using Canadian workers as the last 5 minutes of a Chinese production process. That framing is devastating and accurate, and it has resonated across party lines in Ottawa in a way that genuinely surprised the corporation. Trade economist Jim Stanford, who has tracked Canadian automotive policy for decades, has noted that the knockdown model represents a structural shift that governments almost never reverse once they accept it. The precedent problem is real. If Stellantis gets approval to use SKD assembly to meet its contractual obligations, every other automaker with a Canadian subsidy agreement will note that lesson and begin structuring their own contingency plans accordingly. And when labor, academic economists, and trade experts all reach the same conclusion about a proposal's structural risk across different political alignments, across different institutional interests, you pay attention. To be fair, Stellantis has a real argument. The Trump tariffs were not foreseeable in the same way that, say, a management decision to exit a market would be. The 25% tariff on Canadian-made automobiles created a genuine economic disruption that fundamentally altered the viability of Brampton production. The contract does include a force majeure adjacent clause covering significant market disruptions caused by levies. Stellantis' lawyers will argue, with some credibility, that a unilateral 25% tariff imposed by the United States constitutes exactly the kind of external shock that the parties anticipated could modify contractual obligations. That argument is not frivolous. It is the kind of argument that wins in arbitration with some frequency. Furthermore, the Leapmotor proposal, even in its knockdown form, would put some workers back in the plant. Some activity is not nothing. Several hundred assembly jobs, however limited in value add, are several hundred real paychecks for real people who have been waiting 2 years. The union's categorical rejection of the model can be characterized, uncharitably, as letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. But here is what the structural logic of the situation actually shows. The force majeure argument, even if it succeeds in limiting Canada's financial recovery, does not resolve the political and economic problem. The plant is still dark. The workers are still home. The supplier ecosystem is still atrophying. A successful legal defense for Stellantis does not produce a single car in Brampton. It just reduces the cash Stellantis has to return. Canada would win the moral argument, lose some of the money, and still be left with an empty building and 3,000 displaced workers. That outcome is worse than a negotiated settlement with real production terms. And the knockdown proposal, even if accepted, accelerates the exact industrial decline Canada is trying to prevent. A few hundred assembly jobs now, in exchange for the permanent loss of high-value manufacturing capacity. That is not a recovery. That is managed decline given a palatable name. The pivot back from the steelman is structural, not emotional. Neither of the paths Stellantis has offered solves Canada's actual problem. That is why the pressure must continue, and that is why the rejection was right. Now think about what this means for you, not in abstraction, in the next 90 days and beyond.